Ann Demarais, welcome to the show.
Hi, Brett.
Well, glad to have you here. Really enjoyed your book. It's all about first impressions, and you are a first impressions consultant.
I am.
I'm curious. Yeah, I mean that's an interesting thing. Job title. Not me. You're the first impression consultant I've met.
Huh.
and I'm
There's more of us.
There's more of you.
But yes, well, my colleagues.
Right. Well, I'm curious. Like, what kind of clients do you have? Who's your clientele?
Well, we work with a number of different clients. We work in the business world. We do executive coaching. We also coach people on making a positive impression at a job interview. We also do simulated first dates or first social encounters and give people feedback about how they come across interpersonally. And we also do seminars for special interests like real estate agents or other groups, etc. We're based here in New York City, and we also have an office in California.
Well, that's fantastic. And the book that I read is First Impressions, What You Don't Know About How Others See You. And we'll get into some of the details of that. But let's start with this question, because I think when people think about first impressions, I think a lot of people roll their eyes and it's so superficial to think about your first impression. You know, you shouldn't judge a book by its cover and all that. What's your response to those types of criticisms?
Well, a lot of times on the discomfort of a first meeting, we may not present ourselves authentically. You know, we may be a little bit more shy or a little bit more talkative. We may not be the way we normally are or way our best friends see us. So actually, we may send unintended negative messages. And so it's just really helpful to know how you're coming across in these situations so that you can be aware of it and you can tweak it. And just like putting on a clean shirt when you go to a job interview, it doesn't mean you're inauthentic. It just means you're want to start out on a positive first step.
Yeah, I thought it was an interesting point you made. First impressions thinking about your first impression isn't so much about changing how you are, but actually making sure that your authentic self is conveyed to others that you don't know.
Yes. So you're coming across the way you want to be, and that you're not sending or leaking any unintended messages that may, cause relationships to not go the way you want them to. So you just have a little bit more control. And you don't have to walk around trying to make a great first impression on everyone that you meet or you pass by on the street. But, if you want to, you can know the tools to do it in a positive manner.
So you start off in the book digging into the psychology of these filtering errors that we all have when we're sizing up someone that causes us to misjudge someone. And because of those filtering errors, that's why it's so important to think about your first impression.
Yes.
So what are some of those errors that we have?
Yeah. So first impressions is like a filter. We all think we're good judges of character. So we take initial information in about someone, and then we form an impression, and we expect that person to behave that way in the future. And then we sort of filter the way we see their behavior so that we're more likely to see things consistent with our initial filtered impression and may not pay attention to the other behaviors. So your initial behaviors will affect how people perceive you moving forward. It'll bias them to seeing you in one way or the other.
Right. One of those is the halo effect, I think you talk about.
Yeah, so there's some biases that we all have. Yes, a halo effect. So if you see one positive thing in someone, you may assume they have a cluster of other positive traits that you've not seen and may not be true. So if someone's upbeat, you might think they're also more successful and have other positive qualities that may not be there. Likewise, the horns effect. If you see one negative behavior, you might assume they have a host of other negative behaviors that may not be true. So we sort of spread. We see one initial thing and assume that there's a cluster of other traits along with it. There's also basically the primacy effect. We weigh initial information more heavily than later. So if we see the first things we know about someone, we believe to be more true than the second things we see about them. So people see a small percentage of you and they assume that it represents 100% of you. And then there's one other kind of error, which is what's called the fundamental error of attribution. So it's when we see someone behaving in a certain way, do we assume it's because of their personality or because of the situation? And the bias is when someone behaves, say, angrily, we assume they're angry always and everywhere, that it's their personality. But when I'm angry, it's not because it's my personality. I assume it's a situation, that something bad just happened to me, someone cut me off or was rude, and it's just a temporary or situational thing. But I'm going to judge others in the other direction. So there's all these unconscious biases about how people perceive you that if you're aware of them, you can be careful to be put your positive traits first, and that you will have a halo effect and the positive behaviors will be seen as the way you'll behave always.
Right. Do you know if there's any research on like how quickly we make first impressions? Is it like just in a few seconds, or does it take a little bit?
Well, there is no specific amount of time. That I've looked a lot into this research. People start forming an impression of you from initially when they meet you, just on your body and the way you dressed and the way you carry yourself. And then in the course of an initial conversation, that will be the unit of time. So if we have a 5-minute conversation, you'll probably, use that 5 minutes. You may have some positive or negative initial impressions based on something that if I do a particular gaffe, or I can keep the door open longer. But it's not just 3 seconds. You have a little bit more than that.
So the thing I love most about this book that was really eye-opening for me, the title of the book is What You Don't Know About How Others See You, are these traits or these expressions that we give off that we think are positive or neutral, but are actually being interpreted as something negative by the other person. What are some of these common expressions or attributes that we might think, oh yeah, like I gave off a good first impression, but someone else who was there would be like, nah, that guy's kind of a jerk or kind of weird.
Yeah, so sometimes, again, in the discomfort of meeting people, we might be kind of shy, so we might say a lot less than we normally do, and people might assume we're aloof or arrogant or not interested. We're really just shy and are a little bit take longer to warm up with new people. Or we might be overly talkative and feel like we have to really, put a lot of stuff out there. We might come across as self-absorbed and uninterested in other people, when that might not be true, but it might just be like an awkward, tension-filled kind of behavior that you project. So there's many ways that we can, and so in our book, if you saw, we have tables that talk about positive behaviors you can make that have, an intended positive impression, and sometimes behaviors that we do that we think is making a certain impression, but actually can make an unintended negative impression. And so that's kind of the really helpful way to kind of decompose the way you present yourself and be aware of, oh, maybe if I don't smile and I hold back and sort of wait and see what the environment's like before I enter in, I might feel like I'm just being safe and easy, but I might be coming across as, like I said, aloof or unhappy and unwilling to, provide entertainment to others.
Right. I know I'm guilty of that one. Sometimes I'll just, I'm one of those, like, I'll wait for the conversation and not inject myself in there because I'm afraid of coming off as too overbearing. But my wife sometimes says when we're like, you kind of seemed aloof. And I was like, I didn't feel aloof. I felt like I was in the conversation.
We all have the power to create the mood around us. So we can create a positive mood that's going to make the whole interaction go in a more pleasant way rather than just trying to say neutral or removed. So we can say something positive. We can introduce ourselves. We can add some levity. There's lots of ways we can create a positive mood around us more actively rather than passively.
Gotcha. So you go into, in any interaction that we have with someone, there are 4 areas we can focus on to help bolster our first impression. What are those 4 ways?
So the first one is we focus on how we're feeling. So we're in a new interaction. We're probably thinking I'm comfortable or I'm nervous or I'm bored. It just spontaneously comes to mind. We can't help thinking about how we feel. Then we might shift. The second focus is, well, what do I think about this person? Do I like him or her? Or, what's my impression of them? That sort of naturally kind of comes to mind. Then if we're in a new situation where, like on a job interview, we might start thinking, what's that person thinking about me? We start to sort of self-monitor and think about that. But the one focus that we often don't pay attention to is, how's that person feeling about him or herself just by interacting with me? And, it's just something that you need some conscious effort to explore. And that's actually the secret to making a positive first impression. So it's really about satisfying other people's needs, making an effort to make them feel happier and better just by interacting with you. And so paradoxically, paying attention to satisfying other people's needs is the shortest route to getting what you want out of social interactions and relationships.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people naturally probably focus on what's that other person thinking about me. I think you talk about the spotlight effect, right?
Yes, that's an easy thing to come to mind. And we just don't normally think how are they feeling? Are they feeling happy? Let me pay attention to them. Let me give them some attention. And so it's really about being socially generous. Trying to be, we might be generous with charity, but we don't always think, I can be generous to this person and I can try to make them feel better and feel happier. And so it's really an easy thing to do. But sometimes people are like, well, I don't really know how to be socially generous. What am I supposed to do? How to make people, feel better? And everyone has different interests, but there are some universal things that most people like. And we call them social gifts. And there's 4 of them at least. And one is being appreciated. Almost everyone likes to feel respected for who they are, for their talents or accomplishments, and just, accepted. So that's a really common thing that you can do by just pointing out to someone that you really think that's great, that they have launched a really successful podcast, for example, or, some talent that they have. Another social gift is connection. People like to feel that they have something in common with someone. So if you point out where you share an experience or a value, or you like some of the same things, it helps people to feel comfortable around you, and they will like you more because there's reciprocity of interests and values. The third one is most people like a little elevation. Like a lot of people you meet, some people you meet always put you in a better mood, and you just feel really just elevated from being around them. A lot of people, it's just kind of neutral, and some people it's kind of a downer. After talking to them, you feel like in a worse mood. We don't always think that we too have the power to affect the mood of others around us. And so you can have a little levity. It doesn't mean you have to be telling lots of jokes, but you can just be lighthearted, focus on the positive, talk about funny little things that happen to you. You can just improve people's moods. And the last one is what we call enlightenment. And that's just having interesting conversational topics, being able to share information with someone. It doesn't have to be, kind of heady intellectual stuff. It could just be something that's going on in the community or things that happened. So just being able to have some topics to throw on the table. So that's some of these we can have strengths in. We might be really good at gleaning fascinating information and sharing it, but we might not be that, focused on being appreciative or connecting. So sometimes we have an imbalance. We focus on one of these gifts, and unknowingly, here's another unintended consequence. We might be depriving people of these needs that they really want. Like they want to feel appreciated and connected, and we're focusing on trying to share information or be funny. So it's helpful to think about what your strengths and weaknesses are, and having a balance of these 4 things is really charismatic. If you can probably think of people that are super easy to be around, they probably provide you with some of these gifts.
I was curious, is it possible to be overly socially generous, or is it it's not too much of a good thing?
It's usually more the better. It's possibly too much. Some people have an interactive style where they sort of do rapid fire questioning, and it's sort of like an interrogation. And in some ways, it's like a little bit flattering to have all this interest, but then you somehow end up being on a more passive answering rather than connecting. You're depriving them of the opportunity to sort of share back or ask you. So there is that sort of, I don't know if you've ever been in a situation where someone just asks you a million questions and you feel a little bit on the sidelines of the interaction.
Yeah, or you feel interrogated.
You feel interrogated, yeah. But back to these social gifts, there's something called, psychologists call it social exchange theory, which is, it sounds cold, but we evaluate others by the gifts that they bring us and the costs that they incur. So if someone's going to be easy to be around with and is going to provide us with these kinds of gifts, they're more appealing and we're more attracted to them. And people that have more social costs, that look like they've got needs they're looking to fulfill and they're self-involved, are going to be less attractive and appealing. So we unconsciously evaluate and are evaluated by these kinds of gifts that we give to people.
So later on in the book, you talk about sort of the fundamentals of a good first impression, and one of the first one is just appearing accessible, right? Someone could approach you. So how do we appear more accessible?
So that's the very first of a first impression, is how you kind of make yourself seem comfortable and approachable. And there's a couple of elements. One really is mood, like I talked about. If you project a positive mood versus a dour kind of expression, you're going to be much more appealing and much more attractive. You're walking into a party where you don't know anyone. If you see someone that has a more elevated mood, they're smiling, they're going to be easier to approach. Our body language, whether we're making eye contact, we have an open posture, those are things that make people more approachable and more accessible. And then, as I was mentioning before, being proactive. If someone comes up and introduces themselves, it's immediately, you assume that they're more confident, and then they're certainly making you more comfortable, and they're putting themselves out there so that you can have a more quick connection. So that's really like sort of your welcome mat.
Right.
Your body language and your mood.
So speaking on body language and mood, are there behaviors that, going back to people see us differently than the way we think we're projecting? Are there behaviors that we think are neutral when it comes to approachability that actually make us look closed off and defensive?
Yeah, that's like I was saying earlier, just not smiling. Sometimes we feel like a smile seems forced and that it seems unnatural. But actually, it's one of the few things that I really recommend people do, even if they don't, naturally smile. It just really is more of a welcome mat. And so our facial expression has like lightning speed impact on others. And actually, frowning is something that we scan the world. It's like a threat, and we register it very quickly. And so if you don't have a positive, or if you have a negative facial expression, it'll be more readily recognized, and you will be less approachable and people be less comfortable around you. So it's that's the one welcome mat that I really recommend that you even put on if it feels uncomfortable, but to do it anyway, just to smile when you meet someone for the first time. It tells them that you're happy to be in their presence, that you're, a positive person, even if you are just feeling kind of neutral. It's kind of like the clean shirt.
Right, right. Well, going back to this idea of being proactive, introducing yourself, is there a time when maybe you should not be proactive because being that upfront might turn people off? Like, how do you figure out what's the best approach in a certain situation?
Sure, it's going to depend. I mean, if you walk into a party and people that know each other engaged in a, intense conversation, you don't necessarily want to bust in and introduce yourself. There's certainly situations where if it's a small group, there's another person standing alone, it's very easy to introduce yourself. If you're at a business conference, you can go and introduce yourself to other colleagues. It's very simple, and people usually welcome it.
Gotcha. Yeah, I feel like most people, you think they're not going to welcome it, but most people, once you do, they're actually pretty excited that someone reached out to them.
Yeah, you've taken the burden off of them, right? So you've made it easier for them to connect.
Okay, let's say you've made that introduction, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you've got that little bit of conversation going. How do you keep that conversation going so you leave a good first impression? So as you said earlier, first impression isn't made in 3 seconds. It might be within the 5-minute conversation you have. So what's going on?
Well, maybe I can speak to what we call these fundamentals. So there's elements that make a positive impression. And so the first one we just talked about was being accessible. The next really important one to do is just to show interest, as long as you're not interrogating. But, and that can be done by asking open-ended versus closed-ended questions, not like, where do you live? But, what do you like about where you live, and what do you like to do for fun? Things that can open up and have people share their passions. And really importantly, it's helpful not to keep segueing back to yourself. So if someone says, I just came back from a trip to Paris, and then I say, I went there too last year, and here's a 10-minute explanation of my story, then I've deprived that person of, sharing and connecting. So showing interest is really one of the fundamentals. It's easy, especially if you're someone that's not as comfortable in new situations and don't know a lot of topics. Asking the other person about him or herself and following up is a great way, because interest begets attraction, really. So then the topics, like you said, well, what do we talk about? We're mutual blank slates, right? We don't have I don't know you at all. So, what would I talk about? My model airplane hobby, or my position on gun control, or where do you start? And there are some kind of, basic steps that most people do that make you more comfortable to be around. Just the first one is being in the moment. Talk about the weather or the music in the space or the the speaker we just saw, or that we both know the host. And that just makes people seem safe and comfortable, and we're sharing the same space. We're in the moment. Then you can sort of warm up and talk about, current events or facts or things. And once you have more of a foundation, you can move into talking more about opinions and values and things that you don't want to dive into quite as quickly until you've established more of a foundational rapport.
Yeah, I love the idea of making, whenever you are asking questions about somebody and they give you an answer, making sure not to bring the conversation back to you. We wrote an article about conversational narcissism a long time ago.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah.
Yes.
And it's funny, like ever since I wrote that article and I'm taking part in conversation, I'll see people doing it or I'll catch myself doing it.
Yeah.
Because it's so easy to fall into, because like you have this information, like about it, so you want to share it, but you got to fight that urge.
Right. We all have, the stuff on top of mind, and it's the easiest things to do is just to narrate our thoughts, right? That's the least effort. And conversational narcissists tend to brag, talk about themselves a lot, glaze over when others are speaking, constantly segue back to themselves. It's really unappealing. And, again, it's something that we're not aware of doing. We've probably all done it at least sometimes when we're uncomfortable or something super present in our minds. So it's just really important to check yourself, especially when you're in a new meeting. You want to speak shorter and then pass the ball. When you're with friends and family, you can say, hey, something major happened today. I want to tell you this long story. And that's a great forum for telling your long stories. But in a new situation, you want to really pass the ball back, because otherwise you'll be an unappealing narcissist in conversation.
Got to show interest. And I love how you really hit home the point that, starting the conversation, what you talk about is you talk about really mundane things. And a lot of people are like, oh, it's so, I hate those like superficial conversations. But like, if you're meeting someone new, like you don't want to delve right into like, so tell me your opinion on whatever hot button topic, or what's the meaning of life. Like you have to sort of have an on-ramp to get to that point.
Yes, exactly. I like that metaphor. It's an on-ramp. So you warm up. So, and then, just like there's general things to avoid, like religion and politics, some things that are too heavy you might want to avoid. Or I once had a client that said, he just got this medical news that was really great. He just found out he was cured of something. And so it was very exciting to him and it was great. But then it was put me in a position where I couldn't speak about a movie I saw last night without being kind of like rude. So in some ways, you want to hold back even positive, heavy personal information with a new person.
Right. I think, that example was with like he was preparing for a date, right? Like he wanted.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's it's probably not something you want to bring up on a first date.
Yeah. So even though it's really exciting, you share it with other people. That can come up in a later interaction. And the banalities, the details of everyday life, or what's called negative egocentrism, complaining about one's problems, are unappealing. And also you have to be careful about the way you present things, avoiding this lecturing, like telling people, a long expose on something about, telling long stories about people that the other person doesn't know. Sometimes people fall into sort of what we call sermonizing, trying to convince you of their way of thinking. It's really about talking with and not at, and making sure that you're not positioning the other person as audience, and that you're having a kind of parity and give and take. So there's like a lot of topics you can cover if you cover them in a, positive, back and forth kind of way.
All right. So start with the weather, maybe move to sports, then move on to something else.
Yeah. In some ways it's a little fishing. You just try to throw out a few things, and sometimes you can find common interests, or say, Brett, so what do you like to do on the weekends? And I could say, wow, I love to do that too. I'm really into, some aspects of whatever you like. And then we can, explore that.
Right. Yeah. The other thing too is sort of about using your environment. Like if I'm at a wedding and I'm at a party table, I don't know anyone, I'll ask like, well, how do you know the bride or the groom? And then that's like, that can go like,
that's a nice on-ramp, right?
Right. Lots of great conversation can go from there.
Right. And where do you know them? And so that's being in the moment. We're in this beautiful space. We know the same people together. And then, you move into the next level. And then you find more connections.
That's great. So another element you talk about in a good first impression is self-disclosure.
Yes. That's kind of your emotional self-presentation. And you can accelerate or put the brakes on a relationship by how much you disclose of yourself. Sharing something that people wouldn't know about you, unless you told them. It's really a way when you share something like a vulnerability or something, about yourself, it really can make people feel more endeared to you. And it's a compliment to have something, shared with you. That means I like you and I trust you. So again, we start with the basics. There's another on-ramp. It's sort of like I share a little bit, you share a little bit. It's like strip poker. I take off a sock, someone takes off a sock. You don't want to go right to like the deepest, darkest things right away. You want to ease in and feel out the other person's comfort with disclosing. So you should match. If the person doesn't seem like they want to go there, then you can, be sensitive to that and not share too much more of your personal kind of information. But the things that are really helpful and really appealing is your passions, what you really feel happy about. It brings out, a spark in you. And again, things that are a little bit vulnerable. It's everyone has vulnerability. So if there's, some things that you're comfortable sharing, that's great. It makes people feel back to that connectedness.
Right. But you don't want to go in.
We all have them.
Right. You don't want to go into too much information territory where you're like the guy, I just got cured of this.
You want to share little by little
right.
on the first meeting. Just say, what a fool. I screwed up on this today or something, or just little mistakes or personal vulnerabilities or.
Yeah. I'm curious, are there any other elements of a good first impression that people, I don't know, either gloss over or don't even think about? So we talked about being accessible and sort of showing interest and self-disclosure. Are there any other ones you think are really important?
Another one that's actually people really don't pay attention to is this dynamics that I was referring to a little bit. Kind of like the give and take of the conversation. If you're watching people speak in a different language, a language you don't know, you can sort of get a whole sense of the vibe without even knowing the content. And it's really about like how much in quantity that you share, like, dominate or, not share enough. And so that's really helpful to be aware of. And usually it's good to be sort of complimentary in that regard. If someone's really shy and looks like they don't feel comfortable, you can maybe speak a little bit more to make them feel comfortable. If someone's really likes to talk a lot and you do too, again, socially generous, let them do a lot of the talking. They'll feel good. So in a first meeting, let them have the quantity that they feel comfortable with, and you should adapt yourself to them. And pace matters too. There's no speed of speech that's universally appealing. We like others that speak at the same pace as us. So fast talkers like fast talkers, and slow talkers like slow talkers, and again, have like that halo effect on them. If you talk faster than other people, then you introduce anxiety. If you've ever been around someone that's talking really fast, you feel this like anxiety. So if you're speaking faster than other people, you might want to slow down. And if you speak slowly and people try to finish your sentences, you might want to pay attention to that and maybe not choose your words quite so carefully and speak a little faster. And that can have, a pretty strong impact on how people perceive you. And then again, this turn taking and yielding and interrupting, if you might feel like you are looking engaged if you keep interrupting, but you might be sending the unintended message that whatever you have to say is so much more interesting and important than what I have to say. So it's really good form in a first meeting and in general to yield to interruptions.
In your work with your clients, have you noticed that men make like some common mistakes with their first impression that you don't see women make?
Yes. I mean, a lot of this stuff is, gender neutral, but there are some behaviors that are more common in men. And back to when I was talking about like lecturing and storytelling, men tend to do what we call male pattern lecturing, especially on dates. They might know some topic or read some article and they like to talk at length about it. And in feedback, they say, it makes me feel smart and I feel like I'm giving this, sharing this information and this is going to be, make me seem really appealing. And back to that balance. It might be interesting, but the poor date seems like an audience member who doesn't have a chance to feel any appreciation or connectedness. So they feel deprived. There's a cost by just listening to this lecture. Women, by the way, tend to lean more towards that storytelling error of just going into a lot of details about people or friends with problems, etc., that the other person doesn't know or particularly care about. Men often also like to sort of show off a little. They look for respect, and women look for rapport. Sometimes they will try to insert brags. There's even something that we call the faux segue. So I had a client that asked me if I had pets, and I had canaries, and I said yes. And then he quickly segued and said, I have fish, and I have a fish tank here in the city, and then one in my house out in Southampton. And he told me later that he specifically asked people about pets so he can insert that he has a house in this prestigious beach community, so that he can get that brag in a sly manner. So men like to insert kind of these brags. They want to have respect. They believe that it's making them come off more positively, when a lot of times it doesn't have the intended impact.
That's good to know. That's good to know. It's funny how you...
Sometimes people call it mansplaining, too.
I've heard that phrase. So I'm curious, with this whole first impression rubric you've developed, when you are in, say, like a first date or a job interview, does your approach to your first impression change, or do you just fall upon the fundamentals no matter the situation?
Well, situation's going to matter. So, but here's the thing: when you're on a job interview, showing a lot of interest in the interviewer is really a good thing. It demonstrates that you've got this interpersonal style that's other-oriented, that's caring, rather than saying, I'm an other-oriented person. If you demonstrate it, so you ask the interviewer, how long have you been at the company and what do you like about it? And, engage them in sort of a social conversation. You'll make a better impression because you're going to give some of those gifts. You're going to be appreciative and connecting, and the person's going to be unconsciously, biased in a positive way towards you. And a lot of people on job interviews kind of neglect to do that. But naturally, once you get into the interview, it's appropriate for you to, respond to the questions, again, being, hopefully brief and direct and succinct. But it wouldn't be the same obviously as a date.
Yeah, I think I picked up early on when I was doing job interviews when I was in law school is that, and someone told me this, like they're basically trying to figure out if they're going to enjoy working with you. Like they've seen your resume, they know you have the credentials. The interview is just there to see, am I going to get along with this person? Am I going to enjoy being at work with this person?
Exactly. It's not the most accurate way to assess job performance, but everyone wants to know that the person's going to be fun and likable. It's this human need, right? We want to be around someone that gives us these social gifts, makes us feel happy. You're not going to be a downer in the next office, right?
Right. Don't be Debbie Downer. So let's say you have a bad first impression. Is it possible to recover from one?
Yes, it is definitely possible, but remember, you're going to be swimming against the tide because they've already made an impression of you and they're expecting you to behave in that negative way. But you can actually overcome that. I mean, sometimes I even recommend to people, if they know that they're shy or act differently in new situations, just give a heads up and say, hey, I look forward to meeting you. Just want to let you know, sometimes I'm a little quiet on first meetings. If that's appropriate, that's a helpful thing to do just in advance to prevent it. But after it happens, so you do something, you make some gaffe, like you maybe talk nonstop and alienated the person. You can sort of do like a post-impression jumpstart. You can, if it's with someone that you're going to interact with again, a new colleague, you can send a quick note saying, hey, it was really great meeting you. Sorry, I was blabbing on. It's not normally my style. I look forward to learning more about you, and etc. Leave it in a little email or text so that they don't have to respond immediately. It's a nice way of just sort of being self-aware and modest and, a little bit generous. Now, obviously, if you're at a dinner party and it's a stranger, it would be inappropriate to chase them down and do that. But if it's with someone that you expect to interact with again, a neighbor, a colleague, also, just over time, if you're uncomfortable doing that, if over time, if you the next time you see them, you display your positive qualities, eventually the scales will tip and they'll see, the true you. You could also just be a little bit more directive in that. If you know that the person's likes certain things, they like elevation or they like having intellectual discussions, you could adapt yourself to be more giving the gifts that person likes. And that can accelerate your recovery. So you can definitely do it. And I mean, we've probably all had the experience where we've misjudged someone, where we've didn't take an immediate liking to them, but then eventually, grew to like them over time. So we've all experienced that, I think. But sometimes, if someone makes a poor impression, sometimes you can think, well, maybe that person was a little uncomfortable and maybe I should cut them some slack, and maybe I should see that if they were talking a lot, that maybe they were just nervous or they were trying to be positive and upbeat and it was, an unintended message.
Yeah, I think the idea that time can sort of heal your bad first impression wound is powerful because I've had that happen in my life. There's someone I met initially, I was like, I don't like to get along with, but because of school or work, I had to interact with them on a regular basis. I get more familiar with them, and then eventually I'm like, hey, this person's great.
Yeah.
I don't know why I even thought that in the first place.
Yeah, so we should be aware. It's helpful. I mean, this whole framework also helps us to be aware of the way we judge others and be more compassionate and generous to other people, to realize they may have all kinds of wonderful, positive qualities we haven't yet seen.
I love that. Well, Ann, this has been a great conversation. Where can people go to learn more about your work?
So we have a website, firstimpressionsconsulting.com. We also have this book that you mentioned. It's called First Impressions, What You Don't Know About How Others See You by Random House, and it's in 24 languages.
Wow. So, okay. We have an international audience, so
we're solving first impressions worldwide.
That's amazing. I'm sure, does it change for culture? This kind of brings up the way you approach?
There are cultural differences, yes. And so we try to make that very clear that what's going to be appropriate in America is different than in Japan. And there are a lot of subtle differences, but there's a lot of human nature that's really, a core. And these kinds of social gifts are really going to be cross-cultural.
That's good to know.
And the idea of giving to others first in order to, get what you want in a relationship is pretty much a culture-free phenomenon.
Right, universal. Well, Ann Demarais, thank you so much for your time. It's been an absolute pleasure.
All right, lovely. Thank you so much for inviting me, Brett.
Thank you. My guest today was Ann Demarais. She is the author of the book First Impressions, What You Don't Know About How Others See You. It's available on Amazon.com. You can also find out more information about Ann's work at firstimpressionsconsulting.com. Also check out our show notes at aom.is/firstimpressions, where you can find links to resources where you can delve deeper into this topic.